easily misunderstood.
Right.
And he punches him in the balls.
And then he squeezes his nuts really hard. So yeah, then it becomes a story about Jim Garrison, upright heterosexual man, investigating this sort of heinous, seedy underbelly of the homosexual deep state,
underworld,
the gay deep state, and all of their connections to like the CIA, the military-industrial complex, the mafia. All like these are the people who carried out the Kennedy assassination.
They're the reason that that Ellen DeGeneres came out.
It'd be impossible to discuss every single detail in this movie because it's about 3 hours long. But like as the case advances, Garrison further alienates himself from his family and his poor wife, who just doesn't want to hear about it. He skips Easter services and brunch to interview sicko Clay Shaw. And then, as it goes on, they find out their offices are being bugged. Blah, blah, blah. It becomes harder and harder for him. More and more people are telling him and the people around him, like, this is crazy. You're out way too far on this. You got to stop. Then really gets to what, in my opinion, is really the climax of the movie, which happens about 2/3 of the way through it. The climax of the movie happens when Garrison goes to D.C. to meet an anonymous source who's like, I've got the goods for you. Played by Donald Sutherland.
Booyah. Hired because he talked really fast. And he needed to because he fucking has a lot of information to dump.
And he meets this guy who calls himself X in Washington, who is a former high-ranking colonel in military intelligence, who says, I won't tell you, who's after you or why, but I can fill in some of the details for you. But all suffice to say, you're close. You're very close, Mr. Garrison. Now,
He's based on a real guy, by the way.
I want to talk a little bit about the real Jim Garrison, because I love the idea that, the New Orleans district attorney meeting with some anonymous Army intelligence guy who's like, you're very close. Follow the clues. The real Jim Garrison was a rather colorful Southern character who was actually most famous for his prosecutions of vice in the French Quarter and accusing judges of racketeering with limited success. So I just like the idea that this guy was almost close to blowing it all open.
But the guy, Mr. X, is based on a real guy. L. Fletcher Prouty was his name. Who he wrote a book about how Kennedy was killed by the deep state. He claimed that Edward Lansman, who was a high-ranking counterintelligence guy, actually coordinated the assassination. But he's played the guy General Y is based on Edward Lansdale. And he was a real dude. He wrote a book about it, and he also ended up accepting awards from anti-Semitic organizations. Because at the end of the day, if you're conspiratorial, it kind of eventually has to go to the Jews, doesn't it? You got to have some explanation, where is this group? If it's not a broader thing, if it's a small group, it always ends up becoming the Jews, or in the case of this movie, the gay Jews.
And then again, in
as Artie said on Larry Sanders, who runs this town? The Jews. No, the gay Jews.
And so Kevin Costner and Donald Sutherland walk around D.C., and Donald Sutherland lays out one of the great movie monologues.
Even if we had not allowed the bubble top to be removed from the limousine, we would have placed at least 100 to 200 agents on the sidewalk without question. Only a month before I died, UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson spit on and hit. There had already been several attempts on de Gaulle's life in France. We would have arrived days ahead of time, studied the route, checked all the buildings, never would have allowed all those wide-open empty windows overlooking Dealey. Never. We'd have had our own snipers covering the area. The minute a window went up, they'd have been on the radio. We'd have been watching the crowd, packages rolled up, newspapers, coat over and arm. Never would have let a man open an umbrella along the way. Never would have allowed that limousine to slow down to 10 miles an hour, much less take that unusual curve at Houston and Elm.
Fantastic.
He just spun out with all of this, flashback footage where he basically tells him, we've expanded out. It's no longer the weird gay mafia in New Orleans. This is now the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff, Lyndon Johnson, the Vietnam War, Bell helicopter. It goes on and on and on. It's brilliantly directed. There's a brilliantly framed scene where they're sitting on a park bench with the Washington Monument behind them. Chris pointed this out in this movie. It's hilarious because they're sitting on a park bench that is somehow the only park bench on the National Mall.
It's also in the middle of a hill. It's like every other park bench I've ever seen in my life is right off of a sidewalk. Like you're walking and you go and sit down. You have to like go up half the hill to sit on this solitary thing, but it gives you an amazing view of the Washington Monument right behind them.
It's kind of a perfect microcosm for the whole movie because, again, as you said, the sequence is so like kinetically directed and it just whisks you along. And it's this great montage that includes both actual archival footage and recreated footage that's kind of like all seamlessly interwoven between. And you're really caught up. And then you take 1 second to look and you're like, wait, are they on a park bench in the absolute middle of an unoccupied field in the middle of the mall? And you're like, wait, none of this makes any sense at all.
That I do love that scene because it is like that scene. I remember that scene deeply speaking to me as a
as
kid.
a teenager, I watched that. I was just
you feel like the
my
world is
mind
being
was
revealed to you.
blown.
Not just that. There's beyond that, beyond how it's shot, beyond like this guy's revealing the truth. That character, the Donald Sutherland character, was so cool to me as a kid because it speaks to like a liberal fantasy and a specific fantasy for this type of liberal, which is like, yeah, but there's like a good guy in the deep state. There's like a nice man in there. He'll tell you everything.
Which is hilarious because to burnish his credentials and be like, wow, this guy really knows what he's talking about. He talks about how he had personally, and military intelligence, been responsible for like Arbenz in Guatemala, Mossadegh in Iran,
rigging the
fixing the Italian elections in 1948. And he goes, we were good. We were good at what we did, Mr. Garrison. But then he finds this out, and he's just like, gay people killing the president? No, sir, I cannot abide this any longer.
It's a Pete Buttigieg thing. It's those manless Carcanos are to assassinate foreign leaders, not ours.
Yeah, exactly.
And what he was saying is just like what I realized is that they were applying black ops right here in America.
No.
And it's just like, oh, no.
Who would have thought it?
This is like a very... I want to pinpoint this sort of thinking it was a 90s thing. Every few generations, it's like in the liberal mindset of like the good CIA will prevent the bad CIA from operating in America. It's such an interesting idea because it's like you implicitly like know what they do is bad, but you're like, yeah, but like they don't do it here. It's like it's in not a liberal, but it's in some Tom Clancy shit. It's like I don't know what spurs it, but it's a constantly like reoccurring trope and sort of like liberal oriented fiction. And it's interesting to me because it is like you do have this implicit guilt where it's like, well, I know that like something burnishes my lifestyle in this country being the way it is. I know that it's bad, but like, hey, at least it's not here.
So like, yeah, to me, like this is really the climax of the movie. And when I saw it as a kid, this was like, the most stunning jaw-dropping thing. The veil has been pierced, and you're seeing now, like, what America truly is. And the case that Donald Sutherland advances in this brilliant monologue and montage is that it is no longer about, the mob or these angry Cuban psychos or whatever. That the Kennedy assassination was a literal coup d'etat pulled off by the military because they wanted the Vietnam War, the CIA because Kennedy was, supposedly going to remove, it was going to deeply hamstring their ability to operate and transfer foreign intelligence operations to the Pentagon, and Lyndon Johnson himself. And there's a scene where they recreate where it's like a literal smoke-filled room, and they're like, he's taking the goddamn advisors out. We got to do something about this. And Johnson's just like, I want some. If McNamara goes over there, I want him like stink on shit. And then there's a scene where in that montage where Lyndon Johnson, he's never like said Lyndon Johnson, but it's obviously him, goes, get me elected, I'll get you your war.
Yep.
And this idea that, he like basically it was the handshake deal. Like, I want to be president to do, and let's be honest, the things that Kennedy absolutely wasn't going to do as president, i.e. the Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, and the Great Society. But in exchange for, I will go to war in Vietnam.
Yeah. Which honestly
is like not.
Well, that's the thing. It's like with all this conspiracy stuff. It's you're taking real contours and you're trying to like make a narrative out of it, because that was the devil's bargain of the Great Society. It was the idea that you could not be that like domestically radical without reaffirming your anti-communist credentials, and the only way to do that is to fucking make a stand in South Vietnam.
Yeah, what makes this movie is the idea that, well, I mean, he didn't need to do that because JFK was doing all that already. He was actually doing a better job. He was making the perfect society. I want to see, like, I'm very interested to see how we will see JFK in like 100 years. And
film or the president?
Both. No, before you ask, I do plan on living that long. But no, the president, because he already has such a weird image. Like, for a while, right wingers have loved him.
Yeah, they're all like, he'd be a Republican now.
Yeah,
I mean, which is true.
He didn't run to the right of Nixon on national security and on a tax cut.
You know, Tony Soprano loved him. But
he had his hat.
Yeah, but it is. But like the more time goes on, the less of an idea anyone seems to have of what he did or believed, or any of his policies, or even anything he ran on. And in 100, is he just going to be this deity? This symbol of like, oh, we could have been this.
Well, clearly, because it's not even 70 years later, less than that, and there's already a cult around his son.
Yeah, that hot guy who goes to Trump rallies.
I mean, that's sort of a recurring theme in Western civilization: is a small group of people suddenly deciding to worship the Son of God.
So after this brilliant montage and sequence with Donald Sutherland, where he like lays bare the scale, the magnitude of what's really going on here, is the climax of the movie, but it's also, when you watch it now, where everything completely falls apart, in my opinion. Because basically at the end of all of this, Garrison is just sort of dumbfounded, and he's like, I can't believe this. And he goes, I never knew what a threat Kennedy was to the establishment. And at that point, I'm like, bye-bye, I'm checking out of this movie entirely.
Probably one of the most establishment people to ever live.
The bluest of bloods.
Yeah, that Kennedy was such a threat to the establishment that they had to do this fantastically contrived coup d'etat to install Lyndon Johnson as president and like keep the CIA and the war in Vietnam going. And again, like this idea that Kennedy was de-escalating the war in Vietnam is, I think, based on what you said, Matt, like one memo.
Yeah, there's one memo that was a drawdown order, but people have argued, I think persuasively, that was part of a cycle of, because they would rotate out some of the advisors and then they would rotate in a new batch. And yeah, he gave a memorandum ordering a withdrawal, but I mean, he got killed, so you can say, well, yeah, that was the first.
You can say whatever you want,
right?
Yeah.
But you could also say just as persuasively, if not more so, well, yeah, if he hadn't been killed, then there would have been another memo sending in new advisors.
Well, but those are the advisors who knew how to end the war. They were going to advise the South Vietnamese to stop fighting.
To surrender, yeah.
It does show such degeneration, because it's like, at least with that, it's like, oh, well, there's the word like, drawdown. And even though it probably wasn't what, these people who lionize JFK think it was, it's like, I could see why you would think that. But now, like for QAnon, like Trump will tweet out, wonderful big Sunday. And they're like, oh, that means he's going to kill John Brennan.
And again, yes, from like the opening montage narrated by Martin Sheen to the one Donald Sutherland does, the entire conspiracy, the entire like theory of this movie hinges on this idea that Kennedy was a transformational figure in American politics and society and was going to fundamentally alter the military-industrial complex.